And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball news and discussion. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Podcast on the Brink is a joint production of the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. For complete coverage of IU basketball, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com.
Hi fans, this is Don Fisher, the radio voice of the Indiana Hoosiers. IU football tickets are on sale now for the 2018 season. Indiana hosts 7 home games this fall in newly expanded Memorial Stadium. Don't miss any of the action as the Hoosiers take on the Cardinals of Ball State, the Virginia Cavaliers, and 5 Big Ten opponents, including Michigan State, Iowa, Penn State, Maryland, and the Purdue Boilermakers. For ticket information, visit IUHoosiers.com today. Go IU!
On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, it is just me and Alex. We decided to take an episode and talk about the schedule because we pretty much know the entirety of the non-conference schedule. We're still waiting on maybe one more opponent to be confirmed, waiting on a couple of dates to be confirmed. But we generally know who Indiana is going to play and when. So we look at the non-conference schedule, analyze its strength, we analyze the back end, and talk about just how weak it is, compare it to previous year's schedules. And then also look at what opportunities Indiana will have to get meaningful wins come NCAA tournament selection time, Tier 1 wins, Tier 2 wins, and then how that will be balanced by the Big Ten schedule to come. That and more topics that are schedule related this week on Podcast on the Brink, and we will jump into our discussion right now. And I'm here with Alex Bozich. Alex, what do you say we talk a little bit about the schedule? Obviously, it hasn't been officially announced yet, but we know most of the teams, we know most of the dates. We certainly have enough that we can analyze and give some initial impressions on. If you're
been kind of awaiting obviously the Big Ten portion of the schedule, but we obviously know the opponents. We just don't know the order of when those games are going to take place. But yeah, you mentioned the non-conference schedule yet to be officially announced, but we have a pretty good idea, I think, now of all 11 non-conference opponents. I would assume that's the full complement of games that Indiana is going to have. If you remember back to last season, they only had 30 total games instead of 31. So I think this year going back to the traditional 31 game schedule, at least in the regular season. So interested to chat with you on this, and also had some questions I think come in from readers via Twitter and the premium forum that we're going to get to as well.
So let's just run it down real quick, what we know of the non-conference schedule, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And you have this listed in the future schedules section at insidethehall.com. You haven't transitioned it over to the actual schedule yet until, all the dates get nailed down. But let's run down this. What number do you think will be more useful for me to give? The preseason projections at Bart Torvik's site or last season's ranking at KenPom? To kind of give some context for where these teams are rated.
I would say Torvik's number, because with some of these teams, example, Arkansas, looking at them right now, looks like they were 44 last year in KenPom, and Torvik's got them 87. I think they pretty much lost their entire team except for their best player. So there's a pretty decent variation, I think, in some of these numbers from last year to this year. So I think it would be better to kind of look ahead rather than looking back. Yeah,
like UT Arlington was 128th last year. They've been really good for the last couple of years, but they're preseason number 308 because they lost a lot of guys. So, all right, so let's run this down. We'll do the number that I'm going to cite is the preseason ranking at Bart Torvik's website, which you can see at barttorvik.com. So we know that Indiana will open the season November 6th against the 347th ranked Chicago State team that everyone kind of expects to be a dumpster fire. I think they have 7 players currently on their roster. So that will be the team Indiana opens with. Then on November 14th in the Gavitt games, Indiana will host number 31 Marquette. On November 18th, Indiana will travel to play a true road game at Arkansas. They are preseason number 87, according to Bart Torvik. Then on November 20th, Indiana will play number 308 UT Arlington. And then there are 2 more games from that exempt event that Indiana is part of, with Arkansas, UT Arlington, UC Davis, and Montana State, We don't know yet when Indiana will play UC Davis and Montana State, but we do know that UC Davis is pretty good. They're preseason number 77 and expected to be a pretty good team. Montana State number 273. Then, of course, the big game that everyone will be circling on their calendars, November 27th at Duke, preseason number 3. December 8th at home against Louisville, preseason number 45. December 15th in the Crossroads Classic against Butler. Always a tough matchup against those guys in Indianapolis, number 44. And then December 19th, it is number 311 Central Arkansas. And then there have been reports about a game on December 22nd against Jacksonville. Have you confirmed that game is happening, or do we know for sure that game is going to make it to the schedule?
No, like you, I've read some of that, but I haven't actually confirmed that one, so I haven't listed it on our future schedules page. I'm not saying that it's not going to happen. I'm sure that's probably accurate. I just haven't confirmed it myself. The other thing that's interesting, kind of looking at this, is the timing of the UC Davis and the Montana State games. I'd be kind of curious to see kind of where those fall in. I would think one of those would be between the Chicago State and Marquette games, and then the other one.
You would think so. That'd be a long gap.
Right. Then the other one after between UT Arlington and Duke. And then, the gap between Duke and Louisville, I would say there's probably going to be 2 Big Ten games in there. So it's going to be quite the stretch there with Duke, and then probably likely 2 Big Ten games, Louisville and Butler. So
we got some specific questions here about, what kind of opportunities Indiana will have for Tier 1 and Tier 2 victories and all that. And we're going to dive into that in a second. But what's just your general impression of this non-conference schedule? Because so much has been made in recent years about Indiana's non-conference schedule, and there not being a lot of, great marquee home games at times, a lot of sub-300 teams parading into Simon Scott Assembly Hall. What do you think of the way that this schedule shapes out, both in terms of how satisfying it will be for fans and what it could or should mean come, selection time for Indiana if the Hoosiers are in position to get a berth in the NCAA tournament?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, I'm looking at it as an upgrade from the standpoint of, for one, you've got 20 Big Ten games now, right? So there's only going to be 11 non-conference games. And what Indiana, obviously some of these games are not, they're choosing the Marquette game specifically and the Duke game. Those are just games that kind of get put onto the schedule. But you kind of look at the 11 non-conference games and you say, playing Marquette, Arkansas, Duke, Louisville, and Butler. That's pretty strong, I would say, in terms of just quality of opponent. Maybe not all those teams are maybe not going to be great this season. Louisville, Butler, maybe down from what we're accustomed to seeing a little bit. Marquette could be maybe better than what they were last year. Arkansas is a little bit down, but overall, I mean, those are still quality opponents that have all been in the NCAA tournament in recent years. And then some of the other games, you mentioned UC Davis. That could be a tricky game, a game that could be valuable, I guess, come tournament seating selection time, and then also those 4 other games. I mean, the challenge, I guess, with some of these is you have to schedule some games that you're going to win. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of the beast. I think pretty much everyone does that, but you want to get teams that aren't going to completely wreck your computer numbers. And with the exception of, I would say, just kind of looking at this, Chicago State, Central Arkansas, maybe, we don't know on UT Arlington, right? I mean, they were 128 last year. Now they're projected to be 308. That's a huge variance, so maybe they could be better than their number.
Yeah.
But still, I mean, if they only play 2 teams that are sub 300 and they're playing 20 Big Ten games and they're playing those other 5 non-conference games, I think that's going to be more than enough to have a good enough strength of schedule, assuming they win enough games for that to actually matter this year.
Yeah, and especially when you look at the fact, again, these are just preseason projections, but every Big Ten team is in the top 100 in Bart Torvik's preseason projections. Now, will it shake out that way? I don't know, but it does seem like the bottom of the Big Ten maybe is getting a little bit better, so you don't, like Rutgers a couple years ago, that game was like, they were like 250th ranked in Ken Pom, and there have been some pretty low rated teams, but it looks like, the Big Ten is going to offer a lot of opportunities to get the Tier 1 and Tier 2 victories that you want. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page with what we're talking about here, that's kind of a new classification that the selection committee looks at. And so a tier 1 victory, and it's different based on whether you play a game at home, on a neutral floor, or on the road. So a tier 1 win at home is against a team that is in the RPI top 30. A tier 2 win at home is against a team that is in the RPI 31 to 75. On a neutral floor, tier 1 is 1 to 50, tier 2 is 51 to 100, and then on the road, tier 1 is 1 to 75, tier 2 is 76 to 135. Of course, the kind of the strategy, the thinking there that it's harder to get wins on the road than it is to get at home. It's harder to win on a neutral floor than it is at home. So you get credit for beating a team that may be ranked a little bit lower down. So what'll be interesting to look at is a team like Arkansas. Indiana goes on the road to play Arkansas. That game is going to be a challenge, whether Arkansas ends up, ranked 40th, 60th, or 80th, or 100th. You just know going into Bud Walton Arena is going to be tough. But if Arkansas is a top 75 team, that now becomes an opportunity to get a tier 1 win for Indiana. And, you look at this non-conference schedule, obviously Duke is going to be an opportunity for a tier 1 win if you can get that. Butler, if they're a top 50 team, when you play them in the Crossroads Classic, that's a chance. And then depending on how good Marquette or Louisville are, if they prove to be top 30 teams, then those games at home could be opportunities for tier 1 victories. And then, of course, UC Davis will be a chance to get a quality victory as well. So, I think when you compare that to past schedules, it's relatively on par with what Indiana has had in terms of the top end of the schedules. There aren't really any past seasons that exceed it. So I think from that standpoint, it's good. And I think the fact that you're going to play another big conference team on the road, that's a great opportunity, for Indiana to have early in the season. So I agree with you. I think it is at worst, it's a slight upgrade over what we've seen, because I think the top part of the schedule is a little bit better. And depending on where some of these teams like UT Arlington, shake out, I think the bottom part of the schedule, certainly with the exception of Chicago State, who's just the exhibition games may be more difficult than Chicago State. It's not quite as filled with cupcakes as some previous schedules, but I think you and I both agree, the back end of the schedule, it could be better. And hopefully in future seasons, it is a little bit better, because it does still feel like there's a few too many just, games that, maybe at least based on these preseason projections aren't even really going to be competitive. And you like to schedule those wins, but you also want to kind of learn a little something about your team in the process. And, some of these games may not offer that.
Yeah, I think the difficult part there is, when you're putting together a schedule, getting, everyone always, wants to know why aren't you scheduling, teams in the top 150 range or top 200. So, it's competitive, obviously, trying to get those games. Other schools want those teams on their schedule. And also some schools probably that are ranked that high are not going to want to come just to play one game in Bloomington. They might want something like a 2-for-1 where, you come there twice and then we come to your place once, like Indiana did with Evansville, I think, in the not too distant past, where they, played them twice in Bloomington and then once in Evansville. So it's not only you have to pay a lot of money to get some of these schools to come on campus, some of them don't want to just take a straight road bye game. If they're good enough to kind of not put themselves in that situation. So I'm sure another consideration is just from the standpoint of this roster this season. There's a lot of new players. There's a lot of new faces coming in. It's kind of a new team based on what we saw last year. And so you kind of want to get a feel for your team, I guess, early in the season. Last year, that wasn't the case. Scheduling Indiana State for the first game maybe wasn't the best idea because with the new system, and obviously it didn't work out on the court as well. So getting your feet wet, I guess, with the team that you're going to pounce in Chicago State, and then maybe getting one other game in before Marquette, I think kind of gives you a good maybe kind of base. By that point, you should have 2 exhibition games in, 2 wins in the regular season before you play what should be a pretty good Marquette team. So there's probably some strategy involved there too. But I think overall, top to bottom, if Indiana takes care of business in non-conference, wins the games at home that they need to win, maybe go to Arkansas, get a win, beat Butler and Indy, and then, have a big, strong showing in the Big Ten. This is going to be a schedule that's plenty strong enough to get a favorable seed come NCAA tournament time.
Hey, real quick, time to pay a few bills. So some of you will hear a few ads, and others of you will hop right back into our conversation about the upcoming IU schedule. Here we go. So on that note about, being able to pick up, quality wins in the non-conference, we got this question from Ivan Rinko on the Previum Forum. It seems like IU will have plenty of opportunities to pick up great Tier 1 and Tier 2 wins in the non-conference. And again, those opportunities that Indiana will have: Duke, Butler, Arkansas, Louisville, Marquette, and then we'll just have to see, UC Davis. That game's going to be at home, so they're unlikely to be a Tier 1 opportunity, but they could be a Tier 2 opportunity possibly if they can get their way into the top 75. So when you look at that, what record in those kind of Tier 1, Tier 2 games do you consider, or would you kind of feel comfortable with going into conference play? And again, there will be plenty of opportunities in conference play, and we'll outline some of those here coming up. But what do you think Indiana needs to do in those 6 games specifically to be feeling good about themselves going into Big Ten play?
So we're talking about Duke, Butler, Marquette, Louisville, Arkansas, and UC Davis, right?
Yep.
Those 6?
Yep.
I would say minimum 4 wins there, because, you're looking at, 3 of them are at home, and Butler's in your backyard. And I don't think Butler's going to be as good as they have been previously this season. They lost quite a bit.
Butler fans are going to take offense to you calling that Indiana's backyard.
Well, there you go. It's going to be a pro Indiana crowd.
I know.
And then I would say Marquette, Louisville, UC Davis obviously are 3 games that they should win at home. Butler, and then I would say at Arkansas would be a great opportunity. You can't ever put Duke on the should win list just based on how tough they are to play at their place and the talent that team's going to have this year. So, I would say going 4-2 in those games is a pretty good kind of baseline to root for. And if you could go 5-1, I think you feel really good about yourself.
Yeah, I think the absolute minimum is you've got to be 3-3 in those games. Like if you're 3-3, I feel like you're not probably feeling good, but you kind of feel like you've got a pulse, because you've got at least a few victories on there, and you're going to have opportunities in Big Ten play, but it's really going to put, more pressure on you in Big Ten play. I think 4-2 would be solid, and then, if you can somehow be 5-1 or obviously better, you're feeling really, really good about yourself. But I think you really want to at least get 3 wins out of those 6 to feel like you have some kind of heft at all on your resume heading into Big Ten play.
Yeah, I don't know that I would feel great at 3-3 because.
No, I don't think you feel great. I think you would just feel alive.
Right. It would also depend on the 3, but I would. Yeah, I kind of look at 4-2 as kind of if this is going to be, I guess, the season that people are expecting. If you're going to reach expectations, you don't want to go into conference play putting that much pressure on yourself, because winning on the Big Ten in the Big Ten on the road is really going to be difficult. And we're going to actually have a pretty good feel of how where this team stands too, having those 2 I assume 2 early Big Ten games like they had last year. By the time those 2 games are over and the non-conference, you should have a pretty good idea. At that point, we'll probably need to have Andy on the show late December and say, where do things stand, Andy? We need your first bracket.
It's going to start a lot earlier this year than it did last year.
Yeah,
that's for sure. So let's talk about the opportunities for Tier 1 victories. And I think this may kind of surprise some people, but just based on these preseason projections, and this could change, but these are all opportunities for Tier 1 wins for Indiana that are on the schedule. So you've got at Duke, which we talked about, obviously at Michigan State and at home against Michigan State. Indiana plays them twice. Same with Michigan, at Michigan, at home against Michigan. If they are as good as they're expected to be, then both of those games are opportunities for Tier 1 victories. And then you've got road games against Iowa, Maryland, and Purdue. All those teams are projected to be in the top 50, so those would be Tier 1 victories. The neutral site game against Butler, and then at Northwestern and at Illinois. Those games would also be opportunities if those teams can be in the top 50, top 75, as they're expected to be. So that's a lot of opportunities for Tier 1 victories for Indiana. And so, and a lot of those are going to come in Big Ten play. So that is where, we do focus a lot on the non-conference schedule, and, it's important to do that. And then, that's the part of the schedule that you control much more than you control the Big Ten. But it is important to remember as you look at some of those, games against lower ranked teams on the non-conference schedule, the Big Ten is shaping up. While there may not be the great teams that we all like to see in the Big Ten, it does kind of feel like the Big Ten is going to be a gauntlet, a slog this year with just a lot of good, solid teams where it's like, where's the breather? Because even Rutgers, projecting to be a top 100 team, and certainly we remember what they did to Indiana in the Big Ten tournament last year. Like, it just doesn't seem like there's going to be a lot of breathers in Big Ten play. And on the one hand, that makes it a challenge because you got to bring your best night in, night out, 20 nights, over the course of 3 months. But it also gives you the opportunity to either make up ground if you struggle in the non-conference, or to really separate yourself. If you can continue to rack up wins, now you start talking about higher seeds for the NCAA tournament. So I think it presents a lot of opportunity for Indiana.
Absolutely. Well said. I mean, I'm having a hard time even figuring out a hierarchy in the Big Ten going into the season. A lot of people, I think, feel like Michigan State's the favorite on paper. I can see that, but I don't feel great about it as a prediction. There's been a lot of talk about, one team you didn't even mention is Wisconsin. Indiana obviously doesn't go to Wisconsin, so that's why they're not really listed right now as a potential Tier 1 opportunity. But I think they're going to have a chance to be a really good team.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess if they're ranked 22nd, they would be Tier 1 opportunity. I just left them out. Sorry, Wisconsin.
No. Yeah, the Badgers, I think, are going to be a formidable opponent this season. And, some of these teams you mentioned, I just don't know what to expect. Like Iowa, these are great examples that you have on this list here. Iowa, Maryland, Northwestern, Illinois. Those are just teams that I don't have a great feel for any of those going into the season. Iowa's one that has a lot of returning players, but they weren't very good last year. I think that's one thing Bart talked about when we had him on is Iowa maybe being a bit of an outlier in their ranking, and he based that on the fact that they have a lot coming back, but they weren't very good. So how do you kind of reconcile those two things? Maryland is another one. They lost Kevin Herter. Indiana's, I think, played up there twice now since joining the Big Ten. They lost both times. I think both were pretty close games, well played. Purdue is another one I don't have a great feel for. I think they're going to be a good team, not great like they were last year at times. And Northwestern lost a lot. Illinois, the same thing. They lost a lot of players. So it's tough to figure. I would say this year it's probably not going to be a good year, in my opinion, to be the 7th or 8th best team in the Big Ten if everyone beats up on each other in the middle, if you haven't done your work in the non-conference, because I feel like there's probably going to be, we're getting ahead of ourselves here a little bit, but I think there's probably going to be room for 5 or 6 of these teams to be in the tournament. Beyond that, you kind of wonder how it's going to work out, especially if you have a lot of teams that are like, say, between 40 and 60, 70 in the computers. It's probably going to be a bloodbath. Those teams are going to beat each other up, and as we saw last year, even having a really good record like Nebraska did in conference play wasn't enough to get them in the tournament. So I think with Indiana, going back to what we said with the non-conference, they need to rack up some quality wins early so that if they do stumble a couple times in Big Ten, that they're not going to put even more pressure on themselves to make up ground.
Chicago Hoosier asked us what game could be sneaky tough in the non-conference. So, you kind of take it as a given that, the Duke game is going to be tough. Louisville, Marquette, Butler. Arkansas, we don't really know what to expect from them, but they do have a potential lottery pick. Gafford, I think is his name. And you're playing them at their place. So that game is going to be tough. But the other game that could be sneaky tough, and we've already talked about them a couple of times, is UC Davis. Last year they were 129th in Ken Pom again in Bart's projections. This year they're 77th, and they made the NIT last year. They lost that game, I think, by 10 to Utah, but they did make the NIT. And while they lost a couple of good seniors, they have 4 really good players who were juniors last year that will be seniors this year that really accounted for a lot of production. So they're going to be an experienced team. They were a top 100 defensive team last year. They were actually 13th in the nation in forcing turnovers. That was really the stat that jumped out, kind of the thing that they hang their hat on. And they were a solid 3-point shooting team last year. They were in the top 100 in the country. Now, one of their best shooters graduated, but they have, several other really good shooters. And so when you think back to last season about games that ended up being much tougher than we thought they would be, and I hate to, to bring up bad memories, but think about the Indiana State and Fort Wayne games, what those teams did to come into Simon Scott Assembly Hall and not just compete better than anybody thought, but we remember what happened in those games, and certainly no one expects something like that to happen again this year. But if a team that's a good shooting team can come in and get hot, if they can force some turnovers, depending on what time of year that game is, if that's one of those games that's, if that comes between Chicago State maybe and Marquette, something like that, and Indiana's still working out some kinks, that's a game that could be sneaky tough. So, I know you look at the schedule, it says UC Davis, but that's really the other game outside of the marquee ones that you really want to pay attention to. It doesn't necessarily jump off the schedule for name value, but that's a pretty good team that if Indiana doesn't bring their A game, is going to be a 40-minute battle. Any other games in the non-conference jump out to you besides that one?
No, I think you've already got that one scouted pretty good. The thing I look at, when kind of evaluating these teams, typically just based on what we've seen in recent history, if a team's outside the top 200, I would say there's a pretty good chance they're not going to be all that good or capable of winning. I don't know where Fort Wayne and Indiana State ended up last year, but they, at the time, I think were top 200 teams at the beginning of the season, at least on the schedule. And so you probably throw out Chicago State, Central Arkansas, and then Jacksonville, presumably. I don't know how good they're going to be, but I think we talked a little bit earlier today about their numbers, Jerod, and they were kind of lower ranked as well.
Yep.
And so, you look at Montana State's another one that's, probably not going to be much of a test. So it kind of leaves maybe UT Arlington. We don't know much about how good they're going to be, but there's a reason, I guess, Bart has them 308th after finishing 128 last year. They must have lost a lot of pieces.
Yeah.
And then UC Davis, who you just talked about. So really, just kind of by a process of elimination, I'd say you've got it pegged pretty well with UC Davis, and hopefully they're not for Indiana fans' sake, hopefully they're not an Eastern Washington or an Indiana State or or Fort Wayne. Remember the Eastern Washington team? That was one of those.
Who can forget that? Oh man, I had forgotten for a while, so I don't appreciate you bringing it up since we're recording this late at night. Gonna have nightmares now, more than I already was just thinking about Indiana State and Fort Wayne. Yes, they were. Indiana State last year finished 138th. Fort Wayne finished 165th. To your point, so.
I got a kick out of the other day. Somebody in the forum asked why Indiana was going to play Chicago State, and one of the responses was to lessen the chances of an Indiana State happening again. So that's when you kind of go ahead and mark down a win in ink, right? If they can't beat Chicago State, then that's
cancel the season.
There you go.
Cancel the season. So last question for you, schedule related, because we got this on Twitter. Obviously, the one game that is not currently on the schedule that everybody wants to see on the schedule is Kentucky. Are you hearing anything about conversations there? Any reason for hope in the near to mid future that game will get back on the schedule?
No, I feel like that's a thing that gets asked about every year around the time of Hubers, because you have an event that's in the kind of the Louisville TV market, and you have somebody from TV down here typically will ask about that because they're covering IU and Kentucky, and they can get sound bites or sound clips to put on the news regarding that. And I think almost every year since they've stopped playing that it's been asked about down here, and I don't think anything's happened. I think the chances of it happening have gone up tremendously based on the fact that Archie Miller's taken over, because I don't think he's going to be as maybe rigid as having it as a home and home. I'm not sure. I don't think Fred Glass necessarily would probably be married to that idea as much as he was in the past either. And so I think there's a chance to get that maybe that game on a neutral court, or maybe to work something out. I liked it on the campuses, but I also think that if they could play it in Indianapolis at Lucas Oil or at Bankers Life, or even if they could get the game played in the Yum Center in Louisville and split the tickets, which I think there's a better possibility of the game happening. If you could do it 1 year in Indy and 1 year in Louisville, and you could get the Yum Center, I think there's a better chance of them being able to get that venue now that all the changes that have gone on at the University of Louisville with the athletic director and the president being kind of moved out of there, Rick Pitino no longer in the mix. I think there would be a better chance, and especially with the arena situation in Louisville. They're looking for anybody that they can to fill up dates, because the taxpayers are going to be on the hook for a lot of money if the arena can't kind of turn a corner financially. So I would like to see that game eventually played again, and I wouldn't mind seeing it kind of played, go back and forth. 1 year play it down here, 1 year play it up in Indianapolis. I think that'd be a great thing.
I agree with you. I think college basketball games are always better on campus in home arenas where you get the crazy atmospheres, but having IU Kentucky be played, even if it's at a neutral floor, is a lot better than not having it. And I think there's also something to be said for preparing your team for an NCAA tournament type environment by playing in some of those games in the non-conference schedule and getting some of those big, high-profile neutral games, on the types of floors that you'll play NCAA tournament games in. So I think that would be, I get why you'd want to do it at the home arenas, but I think that would be a silly reason to not have that series if the opportunity presents itself. And the other angle too, obviously Tom Crean had a relationship with John Calipari, but Archie Miller has a closer relationship with Calipari than even Crean did, and so maybe that can be something that also spurs the series to get back on the calendar.
Especially with Bruiser Flint having worked for Cal for a long time, and Ed Schilling. They've obviously Crean and Calipari were close, but I feel like there's more ties now with this staff. The Pennsylvania ties, obviously, with Archie and his dad, as close as they are with Calipari and those two guys on the staff, Bruiser and Ed Schilling. I think it's something that they could get done eventually. I just think it's going to become harder in the future in general in college basketball to get these games on a regular basis, because the ACC, I think, and the Big Ten have already gone to 20. I don't know about the SEC, but eventually I think, all these conferences are going to kind of move to a more robust, bigger conference schedule. And so that's the thing we've talked about before, right? Does it crowd out some of these marquee games in the non-conference? I know Kentucky does the Champions Classic every year. They have the Big 12 SEC Challenge. They play Louisville. They've kind of pack their schedule in a way. And there's also talk, that Indiana eventually wants to play a series with Arizona. So you just kind of wonder, is there going to be space for it on the schedule? Because you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're scheduling like 8 or 9 marquee games in the non-conference every year. I just don't think that's a way to set yourself up for, I guess it's, fans who are buying tickets would like it, but I think you have to have a minimum of 4 or 5 games that you're going to win just by showing up on the schedule every year. And you got to get games in your home arena for gate reasons, to concessions, and you have a certain number of games you have to fill from a season ticket holder perspective as well. So all those things have to be figured in when it comes to scheduling these games. And I'm going to be interested just to see if it's something that there's going to be an appetite, not only in this series, but just around college basketball. Is there going to be less of these marquee games in college basketball? I think that's one thing the sport needs to do a better job of, particularly early in the season. There's too much, there's too many of these games that are just meaningless early in the season that people don't pay attention to. So I think it's smart to move the Champions Classic like they are this year to the first day of the regular season to kind of get some buzz for the sport, because as much as we live and breathe this stuff every day, 365 days a year, the people that listen to this podcast, they're college basketball fans, right? They think about the sport pretty much year round. there's only a couple markets and only a couple programs who are like that. So I think anything that college basketball can do to kind of get people interested in the sport more year round is good for the sport, and that becomes a challenge when you're kind of beefing up the conference schedule, and schools are going to be less willing to kind of take on more of these challenges. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out in the years to come.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts before we wrap?
No, I'm just ready to see the Big Ten schedule. I mean, I was looking back at last year. I think it came out August 16th, so maybe we'll get it.
We got to get this episode out then before it comes out, and this is dated.
Yeah, that'll be another episode for us to kind of talk about. At some point, we need to get John Gassaway on here to kind of help us make sense of some of these Big Ten teams. I feel like he always does a really good job of giving us an idea on some of these teams, because I'm just looking now at some of these. I mean, Penn State's another one. I just can't. Yeah, I don't know what to expect.
Yeah.
Just from top to bottom, I think it's going to be. We say this every year, like it's going to be a wild ride in the Big Ten, and every year it is. And I think this year kind of just falls right in line with that. It's going to be just a fascinating race to watch.
I agree. Well, thank you for being here with us for another episode of Podcast on the Brink. We will be back next week with another new episode. And every week, I don't think we're taking any weeks off. Every week between now and next off season, I guess.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Well, I think we only took 2 weeks off this off season, right?
Yeah, something like that.
That was it. Yeah.
Hey, you know what? There's it may be the slow time for basketball news, but that doesn't mean the appetite to consume IU talk has gone down any. So we are happy to feed it and keep talking IU basketball, and we appreciate you being here with us and listening. So thank you for being here, and we will join you all next week on another edition of Podcast on the Brink. Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. To get more from me and from Alex, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana University basketball. If you liked this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or family member who loves IU basketball as much as you do. You can also support the show by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, which helps us get the word out to more IU fans like yourself. We will be back next week with a new episode. Until then, as always, go Hoosiers.